Hi, everyone. Welcome back to CORT 2023. Some of you will recognize our next speaker from the Atheist Experience Network show, Secular Sexuality, which is how I met licensed professional counselor Christy Powell. Christy will be speaking to us about mindful self-compassion for atheists and ex-evangelicals. What a great topic. Welcome, Christy.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. All right. Well, I'm just going to, take a moment to kind of settle in, notice how I'm feeling, admit to being a little bit nervous. Truth is, that's kind of what drew me to mindful self-compassion. When I was in high school giving a speech or anytime I found myself up on stage, I've always tried to kind of shove down that anxiety or just pretend it's not there. For myself and probably a lot of us listening, anxiety wasn't just this unpleasant emotion to overcome. It was also proof that I was doing something wrong. Proof that like I had stepped out from God's plan and from underneath his protective hand. So there was always this incentive to just kind of ignore it or pretend that it's not even there. But the truth is, by noticing it, by accepting it and allowing it to be here, we end up changing it or, at least scoring good sympathy points from our audience. I hope you'll forgive me. That's really what I'm here to talk about today, how being present with our emotions, even and especially the challenging ones, we not only gain some sense of mastery over them and are less identified with them, but we also gain insight and opportunity to do something about them, to address the problem that's bringing them out in the first place. Compassion, at its essence, is really just a willingness to acknowledge a need for kindness, to be present with that need, and then to do something about it. This slide is an idea that I'm going to be going over and over and repeating, so don't stress about catching it right now. In fact, I'm going to be going over a lot of theory here at the beginning, talking a little bit about the research and the evidence around compassion-based therapies, and then eventually looking at some of the applications and the different practices involved. So as I introduce you to the Mindful Self-Compassion program, I want to encourage you not to try and memorize or catch all of the information or to try and study or debunk all of the research. I'll make sure to have all of that as available to you as possible after we're done. And in fact, you can find the notes from my presentation and all the research I'm discussing on my website at vcatx.com/CORT23. I'll share that link again as we go. But for now, let me encourage you to just catch what you can and notice how any of these ideas make you feel. I know that's perhaps not the most scientific approach to all of this, but in the land of working with feelings, if something feels important, it probably is important. And if you walk away with just one new idea today, I think you'll be in really good shape. That idea may just be the three ingredients of compassion as isolated and identified by Christopher Germer and Kristen Neff. That's mindfulness, common humanity, and loving kindness. Mindful self-compassion and the work of increasing compassion is about working through these three crises in any area of our lives, of moving from a place of over-identification, the way I feel is the way things are, to a place of mindfulness or presence and acceptance. It's about moving away from a place of isolation. Woe is me. Why does this always happen to me? Why am I the only one who struggles with this? To a place of common humanity, which is just recognizing that all creatures suffer and that suffering's a part of life. And then finally, moving from a place of judgment or self-judgment to a place of self-kindness and support. As I said, most of what I'm going to be talking about today comes out of the work of Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer. Their research here at the Self-Compassion Laboratory at UT Austin, as well as at the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. Most of it can be found in particular in these two books, even if I'm going to be pulling from a handful of different authors. Something I want to say here at the start is that everyone I'm going to be quoting today is a researcher with evidence-based support for their theories. And also, just about everyone I'm discussing is someone who writes about or acknowledges having had a significant spiritual experience as they studied these ideas. Mindfulness therapies and compassion therapies, they all sort of broadly fall under the Buddhist psychology umbrella. And I want to acknowledge how some people with religious trauma can be made incredibly uncomfortable by that association. So I want to reassure that everything we're discussing here is not only deeply secular, but of course evidence-based, and that borrowing from some of these Eastern traditions and then running them through a research laboratory, I believe is part of why these techniques can be so healing for trauma that comes from Western religions and Western ideas of power. But I think acknowledging some of those roots can be really important. So Janice already mentioned who I am, so I'll just briefly say that I'm a gender and sexuality and religious trauma therapist here in Austin, Texas, working under the name Valence Counseling. I also volunteer with the Atheist community of Austin, where I produced a show called Secular Sexuality for a number of years. Important, I suppose, for our conversation today is my own experiences with an eclectic blend of religious belief systems, including growing up in a Methodist church and attending an Episcopalian school, before finding myself in increasingly wild house churches and evangelical barns where we prayed in tongues and fell under the power of the Spirit and did faith healings. But honestly, none of that was really as damaging for me as the well-organized propaganda and misinformation campaigns that I experienced in a private Christian high school that left me with nothing of a sexual education, no understanding of the evolution of species, and a really fervent sense of isolation from the outside world. Going to university and learning not just what my education had left out, but had actually intentionally misrepresented was an incredibly jarring and eye-opening experience. But it wasn't until I got married as a conservative Christian virgin that I came to recognize just how sinister the worldview I'd been forced to memorize and forcibly adopt really was. Now I'm on something of a mission to change the way the world understands and experiences their own bodies and their own sexuality. And fortunately, change starts at home. A lot of my own healing has come from the practices and the philosophies I'll be sharing with you today. So, here again is that central idea that the ingredients of compassion or self-compassion are mindfulness, common humanity, and loving kindness. We're going to look at each of these in depth a little bit later, but I want to throw just kind of a bunch of different models at you for a few minutes and just see what sticks. Paul Gilbert's compassion-focused therapy identifies 3 emotional regulation systems kind of loosely tied to our evolutionary history as mammals. First is the drive system, something that the most basic creatures on Earth rely on to acquire resources. This is kind of your simple stimulus response model of, I need food, I need water, and I work to acquire these things. And as we move up the evolutionary chain, we see the emergence of the threat defense system, our old brain or lizard brain, fight or flight to protect ourselves from threats and dangers. And then finally, the development of our mammalian caregiving system of attachment and soothing, the thing that allows complex creatures to form social bonds and to regulate our emotions. Dr. Lin talked earlier this morning about polyvagal theory, and I think that actually graphs onto this pretty neatly when we look at the threat defense or sympathetic system versus the soothing and attachment or ventral vagal, calm, cool, collected, curious, and connected type system. I'm obviously presenting a dramatic oversimplification, but I think that these ideas are actually really visible in everyday life. Here in Austin, there's actually a dog park on a small island, so no fences. Dogs just run wild on their own little doggy Alcatraz, and the lake surrounding the island is full of turtles. And I have always been kind of amazed by the contrast in those two creatures. You know, think about the ways the turtles end up in groups, all stacked on top of each other. You know, they're all being driven towards the same resource, probably just a warm spot in the sun, and they're willing to push and shove and potentially even fight each other if need be. They don't necessarily care about each other or seem to notice one another. They'll step on each other's heads without really any concern for the fact that that's a head or that that's even a turtle. Dogs, on the other hand, Even as they're running and playing and bumping into each other, if one dog yelps, every pointy ear on that entire island perks up to see what's going on. They're concerned with the making and breaking of bonds. They play with one another. And if that play gets too rough, they signal to each other, hey, that hurt, cut it out. They lick and soothe one another. And then once that's done, they're able to get back to playing. To my mind, this is the power of being a mammal. And it's never more apparent, perhaps, than in humans. More than the opposable thumb or fire or satellites, to me, this is the ability that has allowed us to dominate the earth with 8 billion of us. So as we operate under this attachment soothing system when we're at our best, these things still need to all be kept in balance. We often turn off our attachment system when we feel threatened or when we're low on resources. And the threat defense system or the drive system can become our primary operating system. Another important focus of Gilbert's work is on this new brain capacity for imagination and how that creates a layer of alienation from the immediacy of these three systems. Think about a chimp swinging from tree to tree eating fruit. He has a drive, he needs to eat, and he does something about it. And it may require some amount of imagination to remember that, okay, there's a tree over there that may have more fruit, but it doesn't really go much beyond that. Meanwhile, in order for me to meet my need for food and to fulfill my drive system, I have to get a good education, drive to work, bill my clients, contribute to a 401k. It requires a lot of imagination in order to feel like my drive system is actually delivering the goods that I need. And it's this power of imagination that allows us to feel a sense of connection with kinfolk that we've never met, to form tribes and elaborate bonds, or even to feel a sense of connection to all of humanity or to all of life. It's also what allows us to keep our threat defense system activated long after the danger has passed. Imagine a squirrel just living its happy little squirrel life. It dodges between cars, it narrowly escapes an eager dog, it rushes across a meadow with an owl hot on its trail. And after all of that, if it's able to survive, it shivers and shakes and releases all of its squirrel stress, having narrowly avoided death, but it doesn't seem to experience any squirrel PTSD. Me, on the other hand, if I sit here long enough and think about some of the things that my wife said after watching Lord of the Rings for the first time, through the power of imagination, I can get all worked up and upset all over again. This old brain power amplified by new brain software processes can give us an ulcer and leave us in a state of perpetual distress if we aren't mindful about what we think about and how we relate to it. That's why so many of the writers in this space emphasize a need for not just accepting what is and staying present in the moment, but also relating to that moment with affection and kindness. It's cheesy, but Tara Brach refers to mindful practice as a bird with two wings, one being that presence and acceptance, the other being compassion, empathy and understanding for what's happening and why it's happening. Finally, I want to talk about Shauna Shapiro and her work on mindfulness. Mindfulness is definitely one of those kind of squiggly woo-woo terms that as much as we throw it around and use it, it can kind of mean anything. So for our audience of skeptics, I like to point towards the research sort of operationalizing and defining mindfulness. This IAA model describes mindfulness not as meditation, but as a everyday, in the moment way of relating to our experiences with intentionality, with a deliberate and non-judgmental intention, and with an attitude of kindness and curiosity. At least that's what we're looking to cultivate. So when we're talking about mindfulness for the rest of today, I really want to draw your attention to that idea of intentionality, of attention, and of attitude. So when we come back to the research on compassion, with all of that under our belt, what we understand is that compassion is first and foremost seeing things not as we wish that they were or as they should be, but as they actually are. And then moving away from a place of over-identification and getting lost in the stories we tell ourselves, but relating to the present moment with clear intentions, with deliberate attention, and with a kind and curious attitude. I'm going to skip ahead here to the third ingredient in our model, loving kindness. It's important to see that kindness is not just a passive thing. Early research in this space focused on the importance of just being present with a problem, of seeing and being with the pain. And that nurturing, supportive type of energy is still very much a part of the story, but it's only half of the equation. I often remind my clients that if you feel like you can't fix a problem, whether it's your own problem or somebody else's, you may not be able to fix it, but maybe you can make a cup of tea about it. Maybe you can take a bath. Maybe you can take a nap. It doesn't actually fix the problem, but it helps give us the strength and internal resources to endure. And so in a lot of ways, it kind of does. Eventually, though, it becomes clear that this model doesn't adequately account for what was initially called the yang of self-compassion, or eventually fierce compassion, however you like to brand it. This is sort of that like mama bear, white knight kind of energy. So that when we face a challenge in life, like a really stressful job, sometimes the best thing to do is to focus on taking care of ourselves, making sure we're well rested, having plenty of space to vent, a good exercise routine so we can work out that stress. But sometimes what we need to do is to stand up, to reassert our boundaries, to find the courage to take a new job or to push back against our boss. Sometimes when our kid comes home from school feeling bullied, we need to just listen, bring them a tissue or some kind words. And sometimes we need to call the school and raise hell. There's wisdom in knowing the difference, but compassion is about being mindfully present and accepting of what is, and then bringing loving kindness and perhaps some fierceness so that we can change things into how we want them to be. We're going to get away from all of this theory and talk a little bit more practically here in a moment, but I want to say just another word about this idea of common humanity. For myself and probably many of us, this was the most challenging part of this program for me to wrap my head around. And it wasn't until I had the courage to reconsider my upbringing that I realized why. We know from research that pain is inherently isolating. When we are in pain, we lose a sense of connection, no matter how briefly, not just with our loved ones or our community, but on some level with ourselves. We dissociate and disconnect from pain. And that makes sense. If you put your hand on a hot stove, you pull it away. Even a microorganism in a dish will sort of flagella away once we add a toxin next to it. But for those of us with an evangelical background, it can go really beyond that. I was raised to believe that pain came from only one source, and that was disconnection from God. And while God would protect us from suffering if we followed him, he'd remove his hand of protection from over us anytime we stepped out of the path that he had laid out for us. I spent most of my life believing that I was some standard deviation away from God's perfect plan for me, and that my experiences of pain and suffering were evidence that I had gotten further away from the perfect hole under his hand that was shaped just like me. The prosperity gospel of my childhood made it clear that my disabled mother's chronic pain, that my childhood nightmares, that even our rickety old car that wouldn't start, these were all signs that we were living outside of God's will, and that we were, to some extent or to a great extent, isolated from God. True compassion asks us to see our problems as problems instead of as punishments. If there's one thing my clients hear from me all the time, it's that just because something is hard doesn't mean you're bad at it. It just means it's hard. And that our suffering doesn't mean we're less than perfect or less than human or dead and in need of like religious rebirth. Pain is actually proof positive that we're alive. The moment you stop feeling pain is actually the moment you stop being alive, and that we're perfectly human, and that we aren't alone because we're experiencing suffering just like every other living thing. This move from isolation to common humanity can be compared to Yalom's existential crisis of isolation. We are inherently alone on some level, philosophically, no matter how you slice it. But so is everyone else. And we can choose to find unity and connection in that. We often judge ourselves and hold ourselves to a standard that's completely different from what we would expect from anyone else in that situation. And accessing our common humanity helps us to see that we're like everyone else. This is why one of the shortest interventions in our toolbox is to imagine how we would treat a best friend if they were in the same situation, or how we would feel if someone we cared about was struggling with the things that we're struggling with. I really want to highlight here the many ways that religion hijacks our sense of shame and disgust, and then makes us feel like we are these failing, falling angels rather than these incredible, remarkable, ascended apes. Instead of feeling anxious about all the things that we're doing wrong, we have permission to feel gratitude for the fact that we're doing anything at all. When you look at the news, I mean, especially right now with wars in Europe and the Middle East, it's really easy to feel disgusted that we as human beings aren't doing a better job. Compassion helps us to recognize how amazing it is at all that some 8 billion people can collaborate on anything. And we can continue to strive and grow towards more without wagging our finger at ourselves for not already being quote unquote perfect. I want to take another moment to consider some of the things that mindful self-compassion is not, but can easily be mistaken for. Self-compassion is not letting yourself off the hook. This isn't a confessional where we just get to say, who cares? I love myself anyway. This is about saying, well, because I love myself, because I have compassion for myself and for others, I understand why I made that decision, and I can work to make change and repair because I understand through wisdom that there's a better way of doing things. It's not about just sitting back and doing nothing because we accept the world as it is. It's about working to change the world towards how it can be. Even as I work to practice non-judgment, that doesn't mean I don't have preferences. We wouldn't be doing conferences like this. We wouldn't be volunteering to try and change the world. We wouldn't be working as therapists to try and support our clients if everything was just fine the way it is. We can find gratitude for the way things are and acceptance for the way things are while still working passionately to change the way things are. Self-compassion is not carte blanche to do anything and simply forgive ourselves. It's working to spread loving kindness to ourselves and to others. And most importantly for me, it's not a luxury that we don't deserve. When I first came to self-compassion, I often felt guilt about setting aside time to meditate or time to exercise, time to take care of myself. I mean, after all, that's time that could have been spent doing the dishes or helping to make a cleaner, nicer home for my family, for the people that I love. For me, there was a lot of relief in seeing the research and learning that by being compassionate towards myself, I actually am building a nicer home, not just for me, but for my family. A proper review of the research is a little bit outside of the scope of what we can do today, but I want to stress that the research here is robust and compelling. There's been a significant increase in compassion research in the last decade, and it shows pretty clearly that we are able to accurately measure self-compassion, that we're able to reliably and effectively increase self-compassion, and that increasing self-compassion increases not only our own quality of life, but also measures of our performance as partners, as parents, as employees, as competitors, on and on and on. Google Scholar is definitely a very quick and dirty tool, but you can see for yourself that mindful self-compassion has seen more research in the past few years than things that we typically think of as being highly evidence-based. I'm going to give just a quick look at some of this research, but you can find each of these studies and a whole lot more, again, on my website, which is vcatx.com/court23. In one study, 104 couples established a significant relationship between self-compassion and positive relationship behavior, with self-compassion measures actually being a better predictor of relationship satisfaction than self-esteem or attachment style. Testing here measured 84 women athletes and demonstrated that self-compassion is a positive predictor of sports performance, whereas self-criticism has no relationship with performance. One way to think about experiencing compassion in your life is to work to replace the angry, yelling, chair-throwing, like Bobby Knight sports coach in your mind with the calm and kind T-ball or youth soccer coach that we all wish we had. It's in some ways counterintuitive and works against the messaging of our culture. But research really does show that the gentle T-ball coach gets more out of their athletes. My wife and I recently watched a documentary about Urban Meyer and the Florida Gators. And if there's a difference between that film and some of the cult docuseries that we've been watching recently, I'm not sure what that difference would actually be. Surveys here from 206 undergraduate students showed that there are strong, clear associations between better academic performance and higher resiliency, mindfulness, self-compassion, and consideration of future consequences, and negative associations with procrastination. Another study found that, and I'm quoting here, a self-compassionate mindset at work reduced depletion and increased work self-esteem, and thereby heightened daily work engagement and daily resilience. Consequently, employees made greater goal progress at work and experienced higher meaning in life. Another study of 477 participants saw a strong inverse relationship between self-compassion and substance abuse disorder. A meta-analysis totaling some 30,000 participants shows a strong positive relationship between both self-compassion and physical health, as well as self-compassion and positive health behaviors. These things really do go on and on. As you or your clients start your self-compassion journey, I want to highlight some potential pitfalls or near enemies of compassion, things that look like compassion, but are actually just off the mark. First, mindfulness is not about rumination. It's about being able to see and accept things as they are, sure, not avoid those things or deny that they exist, but to actually have intentionality in the way that we relate to unpleasant situations and ideas, rather than getting stuck thinking about them in a repetitive loop that only makes us more entrenched. Compassion isn't about pity. Pity is about looking down on ourselves or someone else and saying like, oh, you poor thing. Compassion is about understanding how someone could find themselves in a tough situation and, forgive me for this, but for lack of a better phrase, realizing that there but for the grace of God go I. Common humanity, our acceptance of the fact that all creatures suffer and that suffering is a part of life doesn't mean that life is suffering, princess. It means that we can have an easier time of things when we actually take the good and take the bad and embrace the facts of life. We talked about passivity and how compassion and non-judgment doesn't mean that we just sit by and say, there, have a cup of tea. It often means that we are out protesting in the streets and working to make the world the way we wish it to be. Loving kindness and acceptance isn't about approving of or endorsing our mistakes or the wrongs of others. Rather, it suggests that we understand and we care about why these mistakes were made. We're not just wagging our finger and saying, don't do that anymore. We're looking to understand, well, why did somebody do that in the first damn place? And is there a change that needs to be made to empower them to avoid making that same decision in the future? Finally, I want to take a moment to talk about what Christopher Germer calls backdraft. And this is something that I think most people experience as sort of like the first wall in their compassion journey. Compassion tells us to be present with the way things are and to offer kindness. It sometimes means running towards the fire rather than away from the things that we might want to avoid. And when firefighters appear on the scene of a burning building, the inferno trapped inside has often used up all of the oxygen in the room. So if they were to just kick the door open and flood the room with air, the results can be completely overwhelming. If there's an area in our life where things have been pretty bad, something that hurts us to even think about, being present with that problem can make it seem even worse. If we've been depriving an issue of the oxygen of our attention, turning towards it can make it seem like the pain is so much closer and so much worse. That's why it's important to be mindful and compassionate about our compassion practice itself, to practice some meta self-compassion around our self-compassion, and to not just heedlessly rush in, but to offer ourselves kindness and understanding about the fact that sometimes it can be hard to be nice to ourselves. Okay, so that's sort of the idea of mindful self-compassion, the philosophy of the thing, and hopefully some of that sticks. Understanding these ideas is an important framework, but what ultimately matters is finding ways not to think, but to feel more compassionate in our bodies. So practicing self-compassion often involves meditation and other body-based practices. This trick that I'm about to do, I guess, usually works better when you aren't in the 4:30 time slot. But let me ask you to stare at that cheeseburger, like really stare at it. All greasy and juicy and crunchy and messy and wow. Imagine what it smells like. Imagine what it sounded like sizzling on the grill. See if you can taste the onions, the tomato, the cheese, and the beef. It doesn't matter that this is just a picture or that all of this is just in your imagination. If you meditate on that feeling for long enough, your mouth is literally going to start watering. Your new brain, with this incredible power for imagination, can help you to feel that oozing, dripping mess in your hands. When we practice metta meditation, loving kindness for ourselves and for others, it doesn't matter that we aren't actually doing much of anything out in the physical world. If our bodies practice using our imagination to make our mouth water, we get better at it. I know it's an oversimplification, but isn't that what modern neuroscience basically says and can be boiled down to? You get better at what you practice. And if you practice thinking about kind thoughts towards yourself and towards others, you get better at thinking kind thoughts. This can be a real stumbling block for a lot of people, especially those of us who have come out of religion and feel quite reasonably skeptical of things that look like praying and wishing and hoping rather than working and doing. When I lay down at night and I wrap my arms around my wife and I think to myself, may she feel safe. May she be free from harm. May she live happily and at ease. Who am I talking to? I'm not asking for divine intervention, and I'm not anticipating the universe, whatever the hell that means, to do anything about any of this. But I do know that the research shows very clearly that by taking the time to wish her well in that way, to have those warm feelings towards her, that I actually am creating the conditions in consciousness that will encourage me to show her greater kindness and to work towards her safety and well-being in the future. We understand that our feelings largely drive our thoughts, but it's possible to reverse the polarity on that, to use our thoughts to stir our feelings and to mindfully and intentionally water some thoughts more than others. Notice how this next slide makes you feel. Does anything happen in your body when you stare at that little potate? How about now? How about now? Notice anything coming up? Incidentally, when I ran through this with my wife, she was just like, yeah, disgust. To each their own. Valid. How about now? We can use words and images and sounds and symbols and all sorts of totems to artificially stir up our emotions and then become acquainted with what those sensations feel like in our body, become better at recognizing them, and eventually better at creating them. That body-based approach is so important for people who have experienced religious trauma or sexual trauma and have been disconnected from their own intuition, from their own bodily sensation of emotion. They help us move away from ideas of sin and judgment and instead allow us to think less about some universal moral good and evil and instead focus on how we feel rather than how we'd prefer to feel. They're amoral, and they don't worry about whether or not we're doing a good job or a bad job. Instead, they just encourage us to do the best job that we possibly can, whatever that looks like. As a therapist, I'm very keenly aware of the fact that no one is checking my homework. When I'm alone in a room with a client, there is nobody who is overseeing, and nobody can really tell me if I am a good therapist or a bad therapist. And that can be kind of overwhelming and unmooring in a lot of ways, especially if we have spent our whole lives measuring ourselves against this arbitrary rule book of moral philosophy. Instead, we do the best that we can, and we trust that there's nothing better to do than that. I'm going to lead us through a short formal meditation here in a moment, but I want to highlight some of the practices that are common in mindful self-compassion programs and that you can find more of on my website. We talked about recentering problems through our common humanity and letting go of our own harsh lens on ourselves by imagining ourselves giving advice to a friend. For some people, this can be a lot easier if they sit down and write a letter to themselves and then use that sense of distance or alienation to relate to themselves differently. We use noting practices to become more aware of our inner critic and our natural impulse to rush to judgment of ourselves, and track our mood and mindset throughout the day to bring mindfulness and an attitude of kindness and curiosity into our lives. We use informal meditation where experience unpleasant moments and quickly work through the 3 steps of mindful self-compassion. And finally, we practice through formal meditation, most especially a practice I'm going to show you now called the self-compassion break. The self-compassion break, whether done in formal or informal practice, is about working through the 3 steps of mindful self-compassion: mindfulness, common humanity, and loving kindness. I've got a written form of the practice here on the screen, and then again in my notes on my website, so you can choose to follow along in that more academic sense. But I'd like to invite you instead to close your eyes, if that feels comfortable, and to just experience this practice for yourself with me. If there is a situation in your life that is difficult, honestly, maybe the fact that you have been at this conference for the better part of the weekend now and are feeling maybe a little tired, maybe a little exhausted and stressed, just think about that situation for a moment. call that situation to mind. See if you can actually feel the stress, feel the emotional discomfort in your body. This is about mindfulness. Let yourself notice the tiredness behind your eyes. Maybe the frustration or the tension or anxiety about what comes next. And when you feel like you can truly feel that feeling, just turn towards it and say, this is a moment of suffering. Or this hurts. Ouch. This is stress. Now, take a moment to remind yourself that suffering is a part of life. That's common humanity. You might also say, there are other people that feel this way. I'm not alone in having these feelings. All creatures suffer, and we all struggle in our lives. Finally, you can put your hand on your heart or just feel the warmth of your hands and the gentle touch and adopt something that you feel helps empower you to say, may I be kind to myself? May I give myself the compassion that I need? May I learn to accept myself as I am? What I love about that practice is that it helps to remind us over and over and over again all of the three different steps or different processes that make up mindful self-compassion. And there's great research to suggest that doing a practice like that for as little as 2 weeks on a daily basis can meaningfully change your relationship with yourself. But I'll just say for myself, by doing that practice every morning, I found myself every single day stubbing my toe or getting stuck in traffic. And when I would start to feel agitated or angry, something would click and go, aha, this is an opportunity. This is a moment where I can show myself self-compassion and continue to strengthen that muscle. It is a remarkably simple practice. If you are not an experienced meditator or have no interest in becoming an experienced meditator, it takes less than 5 minutes to go through some of the different recordings or to even just work through this stepwise process yourself when you're feeling stressed out or feeling overwhelmed. And if you take nothing else away from this presentation, I hope it's at least a curiosity to maybe give that practice a try for yourself over the course of a couple of weeks. Anyway, Janice, that's kind of everything from me. I would love to answer any questions that you have or anything that the audience might have shared.
This was just awesome. I do wonder how different the world would be if we were raising children in this way instead
no
of with all
question.
the self-judgment. It was really, really interesting. We did have quite a few questions. So this first one, I know there are a lot of MSC workshops offered to therapists, and a lot have different lenses. For example, LGBTQ+. Have you ever offered one through a religious lens, or would you?
I'd certainly be fascinated to. I think that there is more than enough there. I'm not aware of one. And in fact, I was actually just crawling through the Center for Mindful Self-Compassion's course offering the other day. I'm very excited to take a MSc for psychedelic assisted psychotherapies course next week. But no, I'm not aware of them ever having really addressed the concept of religious trauma or spiritual abuse. And it feels like an incredible oversight. I mean, everybody who's here, I'm sure, is somewhat aware of the maybe strange place that religious trauma theory finds itself in the modern discourse on psychology. There's still this very, forgive the pun, but like sacred cow around religion, and how we're not really allowed to speak ill of it as a culture. But I would love to be a part of something like that.
That sounds like a great idea. Um, Lilac asks, can you kindly speak about self-compassion with regard to the feeling of being bad or punished when life is hard? So hardwired in me that I immediately default to that. And then I get annoyed at myself. Please and thank you.
Yeah. So this model, I think, really works to diffuse and supplant that connection. At least that's very much been my experience. Um, there really can be this idea that life wouldn't be hard if you were just trying hard enough, or if you were just a good person, if you were the right type of person, or if you were properly responsible, you wouldn't be having these issues. And we reinforce that message again and again and again. I mean, it's the ant and the grasshopper. Like, we just have this philosophy, and I think this is certainly not unique to Americans, but very deeply entrenched in our very puritanical culture, that pain and suffering are the result of irresponsibility. And this helps to defuse all of that by starting off with accepting that there's pain here, recognizing that that pain is not proof positive you're a bad person, but is common to all people. And then offering a solution to that pain that isn't just finger wagging and judgment. If trying harder would fix all of our problems, we would all fix our problems by just trying harder, but it doesn't work that way. Often we need to get away from that sort of moralizing and scrupulosity, something that people with religious trauma backgrounds have in spades, and move towards something that actually solves the problem.
Okay. How do you help clients differentiate between accountability and compassion? I have clients who struggle to accept the idea that they can be compassionate without becoming lazy or being bad, or others who think that they don't need to be accountable if they're upset, e.g., a hetero couple in which the wife says, if I don't have space for my partner in this moment, I'm selfish, question mark. And the husband says, I don't need to deal with my wife after upsetting her because I'm overwhelmed by her being upset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let me click my thoughts just a little bit. Uh, this is a really common pitfall. I think that most of us believe, perhaps secretly or even subconsciously, that if we aren't constantly yelling at ourselves, I brought up that image of Bobby Knight, the basketball coach, who would very famously like throw chairs at his players and yell and scream. I think that so many of us believe that that's what ambition looks like. That if we aren't like beating ourselves up, that we're never going to change and grow, and that we have to rely on goads and pain to move forward. And the research just does not bear that out. Every client is going to be different, and everybody's experience of what they let in is going to be different. I think I'm perhaps wired a little bit differently. Maybe this is my neurodivergence showing up, but when I was a kid and I would look at a big, scary roller coaster and be terrified of it, my dad would just point to the line in front of us and say, look at all of those people that are in line. Look at all those people that have ridden this roller coaster today. Think about the fact that this theme park is open 300 days a year and nobody ever dies on this roller coaster. What's there to be afraid of? And for me, that somehow just did it. So when I start to feel like by being self-compassionate, I am letting myself off the hook, or I'm being lazy or not taking responsibility for things, I turn towards what the research says and what it suggests about the way people describe the folks in their life who are highly self-compassionate. Research shows that by increasing my level of self-compassion, if I were to give my wife some sort of instrument to measure what kind of partner she thinks I am, there's every reason to believe that her positive assessment of me is going to increase as my self-compassion increases. And for me, that really helps to defuse that sense of guilt and of maybe shame at feeling like I am just copping out of things.
Okay, we've got quite a question for you. Paul asks, what is spirituality in the context of neuroscience and brain anatomy and function?
Oh, what a gigantic and beautiful question. I mean, you can write, an entire dissertation or whatever else on all of that. I know that a lot of folks in the atheist community just hate the word spirituality, and fine. I get it. I understand why that word feels useless to a lot of people. It carries with it a lot of baggage. To me, that is kind of inevitable, that baggage is going to exist, because we're trying to describe something that is very ephemeral, that is difficult to nail down. My best definition for spirituality would be maybe to relate it back to Yalom's 4 existential crises. The reality that every human person is eventually going to die and needs to find a way to make peace with that fact and incorporate that into their life. That every human person is inherently alone. And no matter how loving or closely connected or intimate they are with others, they are effectively a standalone being. That every human creature has to find a sense of meaning, and that this meaning is totally arbitrary. To me, that's what spirituality really means. And so if we're looking at neuroscience and brain anatomy and function, I would say that spirituality is our efforts to, I guess, measure the impact of those feelings of connection to others, that search for meaning, that fear of death, and that need for connection, and just the way our body and our brain responds and functions in the face of those crises.
What a beautiful answer. Thank you. Um, Someone has said in the chat, pain is proof positive that you are alive. And that seems to align with what you said about suffering. And that is such a different way, because typically, if we're suffering, oh no, I got to do whatever I can do to fix the suffering and get away from it. I shouldn't have to suffer. I shouldn't be suffering. But then that recognition that is part of the human condition is suffering. That's part of it. Okay. Yeah, good definition for enumeration of spirituality. Yeah, please, anybody, if you have additional questions, we still have a few minutes left. I'm really appreciating how thoughtful these questions are. And I wonder, Christy, how long did it take you after leaving Christianity? Did you right away start learning about self-compassion, or was it not until you were in school for becoming a therapist?
Oh man, it was much later than that. Your viewers can check out the conversation that you and I had, Janice, on your podcast about some of my experiences in leaving Christianity. But one of the stories I told you there is that I lost my faith or came to a conclusion about the reality of God, and I told nobody. I sat on that for a literal calendar year before I shared it with my wife. And the two of us sat on that fact for another full 365 days before she got drunk and spilled the beans to my best friend. So I was a atheist for 2 years before I actually really came out to anybody. And so yeah, it was a much longer, slower journey for me. The mindful self-compassion program is something that I really came to in earnest just about 5 years ago, right around the same time that I was getting involved with the atheist community of Austin and moving from a place of being non-religious to like an atheist activist, and being sort of passionately driven by wanting to make change. And part of that was because of the work that I was doing with them, which involved me reading Dr. Dale Ray's book, The God Virus and Sex and God, and getting really entrenched in those ideas and wanting to find something that was, I guess, amoral, that got away from these ideas of good and evil. And yeah, so it's been kind of a long, slow journey for me.
I appreciate you kind of de-wooing. How's that for a word?
Sure.
Taking the
Yeah.
woo out of the idea of meditation and self-compassion. And yeah, the whole meditation deal people can have a really negative reaction to that out of the gate if they've come out of a very religious tradition.
Yeah, I mean, meta meditation in particular, which I didn't really talk about in detail. If you're not familiar with that term, I believe it's METTA. It's worth exploring. And the self-compassion break that I just taught you is a sort of watered down, might be a little bit unkind, but it's sort of a watered down version of meta meditation, which is really just sort of well-wishing. And that can sort of seem like the thoughts and prayers model that we so often mock. And if we just leave it there, if we only meditate on the cushion and don't actually make change in the real world, then it's all useless. But sitting on that meditation cushion can be a powerful and for me necessary step towards preparing to be on the picket lines.
Yes, yes. Someone has said, how do you learn to love your inner child? When I envision me as a child, I still can't like or love her.
Yeah, bit by bit, step
Mm.
by step. Like, uh, I often tell my clients the beauty of this sort of like amoral framework and philosophy is that you don't have to. Like, you don't have to love your inner child. I would wish that for you, and I hope that you would wish that for yourself, but you're not under any obligation. There's no quota. There's no expectation that you do that now or today or next week or next month or next year. But if you would like to be working towards it, think about that concept of backdraft that we covered and a willingness to take it sort of incrementally and step by step. Maybe you don't like your inner child. Maybe you don't love your inner child, but maybe you like them. Maybe you don't like them, but maybe you can tolerate them. Maybe you can't really tolerate them, but you hate them slightly less. Specifically, I might point you towards Shauna Shapiro's book, Good Morning, I Love You, where she talks about a practice that she participated in, where she literally woke up every morning and just said to yourself, Shauna, I guess I kind of am okay with you today. And then later on, Shauna, I think I like you. And then eventually every morning, Shauna, good morning, I love you. And that sensation, that, imaginative experience of saying that to yourself really does build on something. So, long story short, there is no easy answer, but it does get easier step by step by step. And Good Morning, I Love You by Shauna Shapiro might be a powerful resource to keep going.
Thank you very much. You've given us some great resources today. I think we're pretty much at the end of our time. I want to thank everyone for tuning in and for bringing your very thoughtful questions and comments in there as well. It's just much appreciated. Christy, thank you. It's been a real pleasure learning from you today, and I hope our paths will cross again.
For sure. Absolute honor to be here. Thank you so much.
Okay, everyone, we are going to take a 15-minute break, and then we have our last session of the day, and it is going to be fantastic. We'll be hearing from author and cult survivor Daniela Mestianic Young, who wrote the book Uncultured. And I want to encourage you all to be going to the Court Cafe once Daniela is done. And please visit the exhibit hall as well. So we're going to see everyone back here in 15 minutes. Thank you.